Hey, Dylan Dejesus here. If you've been dabbling with multi-layer stencils on your custom sneakers and you're trying to get those images to turn out great but you just can't quite get there, this video is going to help get you on the right track and break any bad habits that you might be developing. Or better yet, if you're a complete beginner, this video is going to show you all the proper steps that you need to take, and by the end of it, you'll be using the same exact techniques that professional artists use to create those photo-esque, hard to believe it's even painted type stencil designs. First, what exactly is a multi-layer stencil and when should they be used? Well, it's a group of stencils that are painted on top of one another to create a singular image. And by having these different layers, you're able to create more detail and more depth than you could achieve by just doing a single layered stencil. And these are great anytime you're going to be doing any logo work, potentially for a sports team theme, or sometimes they can be used within character design, but the major advantage that you get to creating a multi-layer stencil is that you'll be able to create more accurate, more complex, and more detailed designs than if you were to just try to do everything by hand. Now, in terms of what else is needed to actually create a multi-layer stencil, we're going to need some design-based software such as Adobe Photoshop so that we can manipulate our image and get all of our colors on separate layers. And then we're going to need a vinyl cutter like the Silhouette Cameo to actually cut out the stencils themselves. For other materials, I go with Oracal 811 vinyl anytime I'm working on leather shoes, and then my preferred transfer tape is the Greenstar Layflat Classic. And for today's demonstration, I'm going to be painting a pair of Jordan 3s to match the teal jerseys that the Pistons wore during the Grant Hill era. To get started creating our stencil, the first thing that we need to do is find the image that we're going to be using. So I'm going to head over to Google Images, let's type in the exact team or logo you plan on doing. And the first thing that you want to click under images here is the tools button and select large under size. This is going to filter your results to only include higher resolution images, which means more pixels per inch, which means they're going to be better, sharper images and include more detail. If we click this first image here and we hover right around the corner, we can see that this image is 1600 wide by 1232 pixels tall. That's plenty. I think that the absolute bare minimum that you should be searching for is going to be right around 1000 pixels wide. Anything below that and your image just isn't going to be sharp enough, and therefore your stencils and all of your different layers just aren't going to come out as precise as you'd want. I'm going to go ahead and copy this image and then open it up in Photoshop. Now, in terms of layout in Photoshop, you could have it set up any way that you prefer, but if you want yours to look like what I'll be using today, you could head over to Window, Workspace Essentials, and then head right back there and go down to Reset Essentials. I also actually prefer to have this little navigator set up rather than manually zooming in and out of the image, but that's just a preference thing if you'd like to try that out. Now, the next thing to take a look at right here in the bottom left corner is our image size, which again is 1600 pixels wide by 1232 pixels tall, but our image is set up at only 72 ppi, which stands for pixels per inch. For everything to come out as precise as possible, we'd like this to be a little bit closer to 200 or 300 pixels per inch, and Photoshop itself within the software can do a really good job of rendering out this image and making everything just a little bit sharper for us. So I'm going to head up to Image and then Image Size, and then under Resolution, we're going to change that from 72 to 300 pixels per inch. And then under Resample, you want to change that from Automatic to Bicubic Smoother Enlargement. Now, if we take a look at image size, we can see that our file size was originally 5.64 megabytes, but now due to the enlargement, it's going to be 97.9 megabytes. And that upgrade in file size is due to more data being packed into the image. So if we click OK, we can then go ahead and zoom in around our image, and we'll see that in fact, all of our colors, all of the lines are nice and sharp, and that's going to give us the best result possible when putting all of these colors on separate layers and creating separate stencils. Let's go ahead and delete the background layer by double clicking on it. We can then press delete on the layer once we have that selected. And our next step is going to be to try and delete the black background that we have on our image. So if we head over here to our tool panels on the left, if we hover over any of the tools for long enough, it'll tell us exactly what tool is selected. So I'm near the Object Selection tool. If I click on there, I can then select the Magic Wand tool. We can then click anywhere within that background, and then you'll see we have all of our little marching ants showing us what exactly we have selected. I'm going to press delete and then Command D will get you out of your current selection. We'll be using that shortcut a lot, but then you can see a couple of additional pieces going on around the flames that we'll need to delete also. So I'm going to zoom in and we can click on one of those. Now if I hold down Shift, I can add to my selection and I'll be able to delete multiple things at once. That looks just about good to go. We now have the logo completely separated from the background. It's all by itself. And now we can begin turning every single one of these colors within the logo into its very own layer, which will then form our multi-layer stencil. Let's begin by renaming this layer 1 as our logo layer, just so we know not to do any of our editing, any of our coloring right on top of this. We want to be able to refer back to a nice clean copy at any given point. I'm then going to duplicate this layer by right-clicking on it, duplicate layer, and then I'm going to head over to our FX button, select color overlay, and let's go ahead and select the color black, just so now we have a silhouette of the entire logo itself. I'm going to double click in here and let's change that to silhouette. We can then toggle this effect on and off just by clicking on the little eye that we have right next to color overlay. But if you wanted to bake this effect right into this layer and you didn't want to have that capability of turning that effect on and off, you could right click on it and then select rasterize layer style. That works for me in this situation because I know that eventually I'm going to need a clean copy of the silhouette itself on its own layer. Let's turn our silhouette layer off just so that we can see our logo again, and now we're ready to start selecting each of our individual colors. Now when it comes to color selection and really doing anything in Photoshop, there's a million different ways that you can go about it. And I'm not saying that my way is the right way by any means. All I can do is show what works best for me. So the tool that I'm going to be using is, let's head up here to Select, Color Range, and then you'll see that we have this little eyedropper tool, and I'm going to select somewhere within our teal. That's the first color I'm going to do. And then you'll also see that we have this little fuzziness slider. And what this slider represents is it's a bit of a tolerance scale for how many similar colors to your teal do you want to be a part of your selection. So if we take a look at this black and white logo, that's what's currently being selected by Photoshop based off of where that slider is currently. But if I turn it up, you can see that we have much more of our image being shown within that black and white logo. So that means that Photoshop is potentially detecting similar colors to teal in some of those other areas that are in grayscale. But if I turn it all the way down, you can see that we have way less of that image being shown there in black and white. So something that can actually help us better visualize what's sort of being selected is if we go down to Selection Preview and change that to grayscale. We want a nice solid white showing for all of the parts of our image that are for sure teal, so let's turn this slider up till about somewhere within the 50 range, and then we can basically double check our work by toggling the selection preview from grayscale to none. And again, all of the parts that are white right here when we go to grayscale are what should be teal when we turn that off. That looks good to go. We can click OK, and then you'll see we have all of our marching ants around all of our teal parts. We then need to fill all of that in with black. So I'm going to go to our little plus icon right here, which is Create New Layer. Let's go to our Paint Bucket tool over here on the left. Make sure we have that selected. Change our foreground color to black, and then we can paint right within those marching ants. Now we have this layer 1 here, and let's rename this to teal. Well, that's one of our 6 colors, so let's move right into our next one now. I'm going to follow this up by doing yellow next. We're going to follow those same exact steps basically, so let's head up to Select, Color Range, and then with our eyedropper tool, we can click anywhere within our yellow. And let's change our selection preview to grayscale. And then we're just going to play with our fuzziness slider until we feel like we have all of our yellow being selected. Something that I'm looking for here is these incredibly thin vertical lines that I know are within each of the letters in the logo itself. So I'm going to continue to turn this up until I feel like all of those lines are looking nice and solid, somewhere here in the 130 range. Let's click OK. We then have all of our marching ants around our yellow, which is good. And let's take a closer look here at those vertical lines that are sandwiched right in between our teal and our white. Since we have all of our yellow selected, the next thing we need to do is create a new layer for it. So right here in the bottom right next to the garbage icon, we have the Create a New Layer button. We then need to make sure we have our Paint Bucket tool selected here on the left. Let's change our foreground color from yellow to black. And then with our Paint Bucket tool, we can click anywhere within those marching ants. And now we have all of our yellow being painted as black. So let's change this from layer 1 to yellow. That's 2 colors down. So we can move into selecting our red next, but something that I want to point out quickly here near our layers panel is once I'm done creating the layer, I continue to turn off the visibility of all of the layers except my main logo layer. And again, we could toggle the visibility of any layer on and off just by clicking the little eye symbol right next to the layer name. And at this point in the project, it could be a great idea to check to make sure that everything's working as intended. And in order to do that, let's go ahead and turn our main logo layer off. And if we turn any of the layers that we've created so far on, we should have just those portions of the image selected. So if we take our teal, for example, let's turn that on, and it looks like we have just the portions of the teal right there in black. Same thing if we turn our yellow on, it should be just the portions of the image that are yellow that are currently in black. And another way to check this is if we turn our logo layer right back on and we toggle the visibility of that yellow layer on and off, we should basically have the look of all of the yellow portions of the image turning on and off from yellow to black. So everything's working out good so far. Moving into our red now, let's go up to Select, Color Range. With the eyedropper tool, we can click anywhere within our red. Let's change our selection preview to grayscale and play with our fuzziness slider until we have just our red being selected. Looks pretty good right here, right around 127-ish. Marching ants around all of the red parts. Let's go to create a new layer. Make sure that we have our paint bucket tool selected. Change our foreground color from red to black, and then paint anywhere within those marching ants. Now let's change that name from layer 1 to red. We're halfway there, so let's do our black color next by going to Select, Color Range, Eyedropper tool anywhere within that black. It looks like we have far too much of the image being selected right now. Let's turn this fuzziness slider down. And what I believe I'm seeing here is a couple pixels that didn't get picked up when we deleted the black background initially. So we might need to erase those down the line, but everything around here is looking nice and solid right around 90-ish. Let's click OK. We have all of our marching ants showing our selection. Let's create a new layer, then go to our paint bucket tool. Make sure that we have pure black selected, which is all the way in the bottom left corner. Paint within there, and then change our layer name to black. Now for our gray color, select, color range, and let's make sure we have this set to none first, just to make sure that I can click within the gray. Change that back to grayscale, and right now we have too much being selected, so let's turn that down somewhere right around. What you wouldn't want is any of these spots right here to not be solid white. So right here when we have our fuzziness slider set to 23, we want that to be a nice solid white. Right now you can see it's very patchy, so I'm going to continue to turn that up until right about 40-ish. Now we have a lot of gray being shown within some of the letters and things like that, so we might need to go ahead and fine-tune this a little bit, but right there that looks pretty good. And let's go to create a new layer, paint bucket tool, change our foreground color to black, and paint anywhere within those marching ants, and change the name of this from layer 1 to gray. Now our gray color was the first one to give us any trouble at all in terms of creating a really nice clean selection using that color range tool. So to take a closer look at what was going on there, let's turn our main logo layer off and turn our gray layer on. And then if we zoom in really far, we could see what else was a part of that selection. We have these really thin lines around each of the letters, and it looks like it's around the entire image itself. So there's a few different things that we could do here. We could just go ahead and completely ignore them because the stencil cutting software isn't going to be able to read lines that thin. And the blade itself isn't going to be able to cut lines that thin either. So it's not too much to worry about, but every logo is going to be different. It depends how high of a resolution you get for your imagery. So you could go in and fine tune this by making sure that you have just the parts that you want to keep selected using something like the lasso tool. Right click, select inverse, and then delete, and now we have everything else deleted. Another way to go about doing this, if your select color range tool wasn't working for you for any reason, is you could go in and individually select each part of your image that is gray by utilizing the magic wand tool. But there's a lot more room for user error in my opinion, because it's up to you to make sure that you select every single part that has just a little bit of gray, whereas the select color range tool is just reading the image as a whole and selecting all the parts that are gray. But now let's finish this off here by getting all of our white on its own layer. Let's head up to select, color range, make sure we have this turned back to none originally, just so I could do an eyedropper right on the white, and change this to grayscale now to see how much is being selected. And the fuzziness slider looks good, somewhere right around 40-ish. And let's create a new layer, have our paint bucket tool selected, change our foreground color to solid black, and let's paint anywhere within those marching ants. And that is all of our white. Now we can name this white, and we have all of our colors on their own individual layer now. The next thing that we need to do here is add registration marks on top of every single one of our colored layers. And what this is going to do is make sure that our stencils are always going to be completely aligned. Because imagine if we took one of our colors and we slightly shifted it just to the left. Now all of a sudden the entire image isn't going to come out correctly because we didn't keep our stencils aligned. So you could think of these registration marks as starting from the same exact point on the grid every single time with every single color. And since we have 6 colors, we don't have a lot of room for error here. The way that I did these in the past on a separate multi-layer stencil video was just by utilizing a single dot somewhere within the image, and that way doesn't work out perfectly because you're not able to double check your work aligning everything horizontally and vertically with a dot. Whereas if you use something like a plus sign, now you have vertical lines and horizontal lines that you can double check. In order to create these, I'm first going to go to Image, Canvas Size, and expand our canvas a little bit just so we have more room to work with. So let's do 9,000 pixels wide, 7,500 pixels tall. That just expands our canvas a little bit. Then we are going to go to our rectangular marquee tool, and then we're basically going to draw 2 rectangles. One of them is going to be vertical and one of them is going to be horizontal, creating a plus sign for us. I'm going to hold down Shift after I do my first one. Let's go to our paint bucket tool, make sure we have a foreground color of black. Let's create a new layer here and paint anywhere within those marching ants. Now you can see we have a plus sign, and let's change that layer name to registration marks. You want to make sure that your rectangles are a medium-sized thickness, just like this, since those are also going to be cut out within the vinyl, and that's what we're going to be using every single time to help align our stencil as we move from one color to the next. So you don't want to end up making them too thin to where it becomes much harder to align the stencil each and every single time. Just so we're able to double check our work from multiple angles, I'm going to add a few more of these. So let's go ahead, right click on registration marks, duplicate the layer, and I'm going to press Command T to select it and transform it, and then we are just going to move one to all 4 of the sides. So I'm going to duplicate that copy again. We're going to do one near the bottom here. Press Command T to transform and move it. And then let's do one more here that we could put on the left-hand side. And then you'll see we will soon have 4 registration marks all the way around our image, and now we're going to be able to check it from all of these different sides, and we should be able to keep everything really nice and aligned by doing this. I'm going to merge all of these marks onto the same layer by holding down Shift, selecting them all, and then pressing Command E, or you can right click, scroll down to merge layers. Now all of our marks are going to be on the same layer. The next thing we need to do is copy this registration marks layer onto every single one of our other layers. So I'm going to make 7 copies of this layer because we have our 6 main colors and then our silhouette layer. So let's go ahead and duplicate this till we have 7 of these. And then we are going to place one on top of every single layer. So I have registration marks copy 3 right on top of my white layer. I'm going to grab the copy number 4, put that on top of my gray layer. Let's grab the next one, put that on top of our black layer, and so on and so on. Now your layers panel should look a little something like this, where we have a registration marks copy right on top of each of our individual colors, along with the silhouette layer. I'm going to turn all of these off just so we can see what we have going on near the white layer. So again, if we turn on just our layer that is labeled white, you can see we have just the portions of the image that are going to be white. And if we turn on that registration marks copy 3, you'll see that we have those 4 different plus signs around it. I want to merge all of those registration marks to be on my white layer. So what I'm going to do is select registration marks copy 3 and then press Command E. That's going to merge that layer down right on top of my white layer. If I toggle the visibility of that, you can see that we have those registration marks merged onto that white layer. So again, doing that with the gray layer here, let's turn that on. You'll see we have just the portions of the image that are gray. If we turn on registration marks copy 4, you can see we have those 4 marks surrounding it. I'm going to select registration marks copy 4 and then press Command E to merge it down, and it's going to merge itself right on top of my gray layer. And it's what's really nice about doing it that way is it's going to keep my layer names correctly, whereas if I were to turn on my black layer and then turn on registration marks copy 5, if I were to select both of these by holding down Shift and then pressing Command E, you'll see that now that layer is labeled registration marks copy 5 and it's no longer labeled black. So I can go ahead and change that manually, but if you have a bunch of different colors, it's easy to forget to do that. So I like to go ahead and just turn on the color, turn on the registration marks copy 6 on top of my red, and then select that registration marks layer, press Command E, merge that right down, and it's going to keep those layer names, which are just really nice for organization's sake. So let's go ahead and do the few other colors we have left: yellow, teal, and our silhouette layer also. Now we're basically ready to get all of our layers sent over to the stencil cutting software. The only thing that we have left to do is rearrange them here in this document so that they're not stacked on top of one another. So let's go ahead and turn off our main logo layer. Let's turn on all of the other layers, and then I'm going to select one of them, such as this white layer. Let's hold down Shift and select the rest of them. Press Command T for the transform tool, and then we can drag from any of these points to scale this down proportionally. The reason we're not worried about sacrificing any detail when scaling these down is because we did that bicubic smoother enlargement earlier, and we're working in this huge 9,000 pixels wide document. When we get to the stencil cutting software, the cutting mats are only 12 inches wide anyway, so we don't have anything to really worry about in terms of sacrificing quality. So the next step is to select each of our individual layers, press Command T, and then we are just going to rearrange them here in this document. Give them plenty of space in between, just so that when we go ahead and cut them out with the vinyl, we won't have any pieces overlapping one another. So now you should be able to see we have each of our 6 colors and our silhouette layer, making 7 total. We're ready to get this set up for export. There's a couple different ways you could go about doing that. I'm going to export as a PNG because the stencil cutting software is actually going to turn all of my black lines into cut lines when we get into Silhouette Studio. That's exactly what we want. If I were to save this as a JPEG, we then have one additional step to do when we get to the stencil cutting software. We would have to tell the software to do a live trace over our entire image and convert all of our black lines into cut lines. So it's essentially removing a step if you save this as a PNG versus saving it as a JPEG. So I'm going to go up to File, Export, Quick Export as PNG. You could save this anywhere on your computer, and let's just call this Pistons Multi-Layer Stencil. All right, now we're ready to fire up our stencil cutting software. So I'm going to be using Silhouette Studio. So once we have that opened up, we can open up our file by going to File, Open. I saved that on my desktop under Pistons Multi-Layer Stencil, and that looks good to go. Now that we have our image loaded here in Silhouette Studio, the next step that we need to decide is exactly how big do we want this to be in terms of measurements and where we're going to be placing it on our shoes. Now there's a few different ways that you could go about deciding that. You could do a digital mock-up beforehand, so you could play around with a few different sizes for your image, see what works best. You could take a picture of the shoes that you're going to be working on, load the image right on top and play around with some different scales, see what works for you. I'm going to do a digital mock-up. So if you head to Google, type in the name of the shoe that you're working on, followed by the word template, there's a really good chance that you're going to find a perfect template to do a digital mock-up on top of. So I've already loaded this Jordan 3 into Photoshop. I've painted the panel teal that I'm going to have completely teal. And then I have my logo on its own layer here. And what I'm going to be doing today is what I like to call an oversized logo. And what I mean by that is certain parts of my logo are going to be extended onto other panels that are eventually going to be painted over. So I have those on another layer here called layer 3 copy. If I turn that on, you'll see that certain parts of my logo get painted over, and that's why it's called an oversized logo. If I didn't want that, if I wanted that logo to just fit perfectly within the teal, what I could do is head over to my logo layer, press Command T, and let's just go ahead and scale that down until we have that fitting within the ranges of just that teal panel. Now, just for today's design, I prefer that oversized look, and this is an incredibly detailed logo, so the larger I'm able to make it, the easier my job's going to be in terms of making sure that all of those details come out nice and crisp. So let's press Command Z to undo that transform, and then what I can see here, if I turn off some of those painted panels, I could then grab my rectangular marquee tool, and basically you'll see here at the edge of my P, that's the furthest point on my left. And then right here near the bottom of my S, that's the furthest point at the right of the image. So if I draw a quick little rectangle from the far extent of my S to the far extent of my P, that right there is basically the maximum width that I'm gonna have in terms of my measurement when loading the cut files. So that little white rectangle that I've made right there is basically the exact width that I want to cut out for the silhouette layer in Silhouette Studio. I'm just going to draw in a couple of reference lines real quick here in Photoshop in yellow, just so it's easier for you to visualize what I'm referring to in terms of the width that I want for this image. So my next step is going to be to grab the actual pair of shoes I'm working on and measure out exactly how wide it is from one yellow line to the other on my working surface. And that's going to give me the width that I'm going to input in our stencil cutting software to determine the size of all of our layers. So 4.25 was the measurement that I came up with there, but now let's hop back into Silhouette Studio. So there's a couple things that I like to set up first. Let's go to our page setup panel. I'm going to click on our grid settings. Let's click on show grid, and let's change our divisions to 2. Since we're working on a 12 by 12 cutting mat, all of these larger squares are going to be 1 inch by 1 inch. These smaller squares inside of those are going to be 1/2 inch squares. But now let's zoom out a little bit, and when we import this PNG into Silhouette Studio initially, it imports it and groups it all together as one image. So if I drag to select there, you'll see that right now it's saying the image is 27.5 inches wide. That doesn't really help us in terms of me getting the individual silhouette layer to be 4.25 inches wide. So what I need to do is separate these again, since it all imports as one solid thing. So let's right click on release compound path, and then we need to go in and individually drag to select each of our layers, again, the colors, along with the registration mark. So I'm going to right click on there after I've done that, select group, and we need to do that for every single one. So drag to select from a corner, right click and select group, and you want to make sure that you're not just clicking one point inside and selecting group, because it's not going to group everything together. So you want to make sure you drag to select everything, and we're going to click group on each of those. Now, if I were to select my silhouette layer, you could see right now it's saying that it is 7.093 inches wide. But that is 7.093 inches at the edges of my registration marks, since those are now the widest points that we have on this little image right here. But I only want it to be 4.25 at the edges of the silhouette. So what I'm going to do is let's grab a rectangle from over here on our left hand side. Let's scale that out. Right now it's 7.1 inches wide. Up top on this toolbar we have our width selection. I'm going to change that from 7.1 to 4.25. Now we have a 4.25 inches wide rectangle. Just so it's easier for us to visualize, let's color in this rectangle rather than just showing the red cut lines. So I'm going to go over here to our paint palette and let's change that to a solid yellow. Now, this is the exact width we want that silhouette to be. So you can see it's still a little bit too big. So what we need to do is select all of our layers, make sure that you have every single one of them selected, and scale that down until you have just the width of that yellow rectangle there. We're starting to get closer and closer. That's pretty good. And if I hold that up to there, still going to scale it down a little bit further. And we are pretty close right there. What you don't want to happen is to only have your silhouette layer selected and scale that up to match it, because as you can see right now, I'm only controlling that silhouette layer and I'm not scaling all of the other colors equally, which is what we don't want to happen. We need to make sure that everything is constantly scaling equally. So let's go ahead and just get out of there. Let's press Command Z. And I think that let's take a closer zoom in to make sure we have that exactly as we want it. Drag around this yellow rectangle, and that looks good to go to me. So the reason that we can't just input 4.25 here is because, again, the edges of my registration marks are the actual width being shown right here, since it's all grouped together. So 5.35 is from the edge of my left registration mark over here to the furthest edge on my right registration mark over here. A quick way to double check here is let's go ahead and ungroup the registration marks from the silhouette layer. So I'm going to right click, ungroup. Now those registration marks and the silhouette itself are no longer grouped together. So if I select on the silhouette itself and drag that around, you can see it's no longer connected, but my silhouette is 4.25 inches wide, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to press Command Z, and then let's make sure we have all of that grouped together again. Now we're ready to start rearranging all of these onto our cutting mat. So let's go ahead and close out of this fill panel here. If you're working with a different size cutting mat, you could change all of those inputs here in the page setup panel. So the machine I'm going to be using is a Silhouette Cameo 3, a cutting mat that is 12 by 12, and my media size, the vinyl that I'm going to cut out, is also 12 by 12. But if you have a different size cutting mat, potentially one that's only 8 inches wide, this is where you would change all of that. So let's go ahead and close out of that page setup panel now, and we could start dragging all of these to rearrange them here on our cutting mat. It looks like I'm only going to be able to fit 4 on each 12 by 12 sheet of vinyl. So I will have to use another sheet to cut out these 3 that I have over here on the left. Now we can basically head over to our send button, and what I like to do here is change our material from cardstock to vinyl, and the specific one that I like to use is under vinyl glossy. Now there's a ton of great presets here for a lot of different materials that you can cut with your machine, but I found the presets for vinyl glossy work really well with the Oracal 811 vinyl. And then when it comes to all of these individual settings that you can tweak, such as blade depth, if you're working with a relatively fresh blade, you can keep that blade depth at 1, especially if the only material that you're cutting with your stencil cutter is vinyl. It's really not going to dull out that much over time. But if you were putting this thing under heavy use, that blade depth is something that you could start to turn up a little bit. In terms of the other settings, we have force and speed. Now, just a few rules of thumb for determining if you should ever tweak those. If you have an image that is all straight lines, you could speed it up a little bit. It's going to still cut through all the way, and all of those lines are still going to come out as intended. If you had an image that was, let's just say it was a perfect circle, there was no straight lines involved, it might be a good idea to turn down your speed a little bit. So think of your speed in terms of lower speed for more curves and higher speed for more straight lines. But if you have an image like this that has a nice combination of straight lines and curved lines, you could keep it somewhere right in the middle. So 5 tends to be the perfect number for doing an image like this. Now, when it comes to force, that tends to be the first setting out of all of these that I'm going to tweak depending on how my vinyl is cutting. So if I were to run this through the vinyl cutter and it didn't cut all the way through, the first thing that I'm going to change is my force setting. So you could turn it all the way up to 32, but that's far too deep when just cutting on vinyl. So I tend to work in maybe increments of 2 or 3. So if this didn't cut through, let's see what happens if I turn my force up to 13. But let's just say I had an even more detailed, smaller image potentially, and let's just say a lot of that vinyl was peeling up, the cuts just weren't very clean. I might turn my force settings down to 7 7 or 8 and see what happens there. But if you're just looking for a great starting point, you have a fresh blade, the preset settings under Vinyl Glossy are the way to go, and then you can tweak it from there. Before we can press send though, let's go ahead and get our vinyl cut out and placed onto our cutting mat. I also recommend taping your vinyl down to your cutting mat just to make sure that it's going to remain as flat as possible. And with our cutting mat loaded, let's go ahead and click send. That's one sheet down that we can go ahead and remove from our cutting mat, and we're ready to load our next sheet directly on top. Back in Silhouette Studio, we need to swap out what we just cut for our additional 3 stencils. So let's go to our design area. We can move all of these ones that we just cut off to the side and grab these 3 additional ones and rearrange them on our cutting mat. Now we can head back to our send tab and we are good to go. Now that we have all 7 of our stencils cut out onto these 2 sheets, let's go ahead and trim them down one step further so that we can have every single one on its own sheet. We can then grab some of our Greenstar Layflat Classic transfer tape and place that over the entire image. It's going to be really easy to rip off any of the excess down the line, so make sure that you just cover up the entire thing. I'm going to use this Silhouette scraper tool to press down very firmly on top of my transfer tape so that we can create a nice tight bond between the transfer tape and the vinyl so that all of my vinyl will easily transfer from the backing of the vinyl onto the transfer tape itself. Let's flip this over and then we can separate our stencil from our blue backing by peeling that right off. This is where you should start to be able to tell if your lines cut through all the way. In the event that they didn't cut through, you may need to head back to your stencil cutting software and tweak some of those force or thickness settings. But if everything cut out nice and smooth for you, we can then start peeling back some of this excess vinyl, which can also be referred to as the negative portion of the stencil, and we will not need to save this negative portion on any of our colored layers except for our main silhouette base layer. And the reason for that is we're only going to be using the positive portions of each stencil to cover up the color that we just laid down, so we'll only need to use the negative portion once on our initial silhouette layer, and that will stay down throughout the entire process. Sometimes you might see stencil work done a little bit differently where you weed out the portions of the stencil that you don't plan on using before ever actually applying the transfer tape, but I find this method to be much easier as long as everything actually cut through all the way. Once we have the entire stencil stuck to the adhesive of the transfer tape, it should be very easy to remove the negative portions of the stencil without a ton of finagling and holding pieces down, because now all of the positive portions of the stencil will be stuck to the adhesive of the transfer tape. So this way of doing it when you know you're only going to need the positive portions of the stencil seems to go a little bit smoother for me. Something else to take note of is you want to make sure that all 4 of your registration marks have also been transferred onto every individual stencil. If you have a bunch of different colors or layers, it can also be a good idea at this point to label these with their specific colors so that you don't get confused down the line. Now that we have all of these labeled and separated, we need to remove some of the excess transfer tape that's on top of each one, and this is why I love working with this brand of transfer tape, because it's so easy to just rip off any of that excess transfer tape right up to the edge. I can even see some of the edge peeking out and everything's still completely intact. There's a lot of other transfer tapes out on the market, but typically they're going to be much more rigid, a little bit harder to work with in my opinion, because you're going to need to use either a pair of scissors or a knife just to remove any of that excess. But with this one, I could rip it off right up to the edges of those registration marks or to the edges of the image itself, and this is just going to make it so much easier for me to visualize where exactly I'm placing this, and this is going to help me align things so much better. Once all of those are fine-tuned and we've removed that excess transfer tape, we can finally finally begin laying this stencil down onto our pair of shoes. So I'm going to start by grabbing the positive portion of my silhouette stencil and placing this exactly where I want the image to be on my pair of shoes. And at this point, I like to refer back to my mockup just to make sure that I'm going to be placing this image exactly where I intended to. Once we have that placed exactly where we need it to be, I like to grab the back of an old airbrush needle and just press down firmly on my vinyl everywhere. Then we can start to slowly peel back on our transfer tape, and take your time with this step, have some patience, because you want to make sure that all of the different portions of the stencil are staying perfectly intact and not rearranging as you're working on a different side of the stencil, peeling back some of that transfer tape. If you take a look at our top registration mark, you can see that that landed on the taped off sock liner portion of the shoe, so that would be a bad thing if that was our one and only registration mark. It would have been better if it landed sort of in this region over here where it's still nice and flat, but because we have 3 other ones, we will still be able to align everything as intended. I will just be ignoring this top one moving forward throughout the process. Now we're ready to place the negative portion of our silhouette stencil around the positive portion, but one thing that I did here first is I cut the negative portion of the stencil into 2 pieces. And the reason for that is because we're not working on a perfectly flat surface here. If you were just working on a canvas, you wouldn't need to do this step, but because we're working on a curved surface, it's a lot harder for one large piece like this to be worked around the positive portion of the stencil and still lay flat. So if I cut it into 2 pieces, then it's going to make my job a whole lot easier of working these 2 separate portions around the stencil and aligning things exactly as I need them to be. After that, I'm going to do a little bit of heat setting while pressing down with my finger on top of the vinyl. And now I'm going to use my old airbrush needle to remove the positive portion of the stencil, and you'll finally be able to see the area in which we'll be painting. If any areas of your stencil get lifted while you're removing other portions, definitely make sure that you take the time to go back in, press them down firmly, and apply some more heat. Make sure to go back and add tape on any areas that you've added cuts into your vinyl. Coincidentally enough for me though, these both happen to fall into areas that I already have taped off underneath though. And right before we're finally ready to paint, just to play it safe, I'm going to add some of this Protapes crepe paper, which is a really nice wide tape around our entire stencil, just to make sure that I don't get any paint on any unintended areas. Quick sidebar over here, if you find yourself working on a pair of shoes like Jordan 1s where you're trying to stretch an image across many different panels and many different curves, you're going to need to cut more slits into the different pieces of vinyl. If I was doing this same exact logo and stencil on a pair of Jordan 1s, adding these additional slits into the positive portion here would create more flat surfaces for the vinyl to lie. Then on the negative portion of the vinyl, I would remove as much excess as possible, since increased surface area only makes it harder to work around the different panels and curves. Then I would slice the rest of the negative portion into at least 4 separate pieces and start placing that around the silhouette layer. Now here's probably the most important part about working a stencil around different panels and curves like this. Any areas where you have 2 panels meet, you need to add slits in the vinyl so that it can lie flat on 2 separate panels rather than stretching across them. This would be where you typically see a lot of those blowouts once you finally remove the vinyl, since it was never actually lying flat. Then you want to take note of all areas where you've added these little slits or cuts into your vinyl and head back to mask them off. So the moral of this story is the more panels and the more curves you plan on stretching an image across, the more slits and the more cuts you want to add into your vinyl so that we can create as much flat contact as possible for the vinyl itself. So now, how do we actually determine the order in which we're going to be painting all of our colors? I think that this can be a little bit of a tricky answer because I don't think that there is a perfect answer. I think that it can really vary on a case-by-case situation depending on the logo, depending on the background that you have underneath the stencil, but I do believe there are a few general guidelines, some rules of thumb that you can follow in order to make your own determination. First off, if your background color that you have underneath the stencil is also one of the colors involved in the logo, I think that should be the first color that you lay down and then cover up with the correlating stencil. For the pair that I'm working on, since I already have a teal background laid down, and teal is also one of the 6 colors involved in my logo, that is going to be the first color or the first layer of my multi-layer stencil. But because I always like to paint in this pattern or texture work on all of my pairs, I need to make this a completely solid teal, but that should cover up really easily in just 1 or 2 coats. Same old rules apply here as if you're base coating a shoe. You want nice thin layers of paint and make sure to allow plenty of dry time in between coats. Now, one mistake that I made here that I didn't catch till afterwards is if you take a look on the right hand side at that registration mark, a little bit of the leather underneath the stencil is exposed. So if I were to lay a bunch of color on top here, once I finally peel back all of this vinyl, then I would end up with this weird colored plus sign. So you need to make sure that you always have these markings covered up with tape or the positive portion of the stencil itself. Now if you take a look at the left hand side and the bottom registration mark, those are placed on areas of the shoe that I already have completely masked off. The bottom one is near the midsole and the left hand side one is near the cement print area, and I already have both of those areas completely masked off, so I'm not worried about any paint showing underneath. Now we can grab the positive portion of our teal stencil and begin aligning that with each of our registration marks. Take your time here and make sure we can get this lined up right where we need it to be. You should constantly be pressing down on different areas of the stencil to make sure it can begin to lie as flat as possible before attempting to remove the transfer tape. Since this transfer tape is a relatively low adhesive, if it's just not quite lining up for you, you can lift up your entire stencil and begin the realignment process. Since we're now going to be working with extremely small and thin pieces, once we start peeling back our transfer tape, I recommend having an airbrush needle in your other hand so that while you're peeling back the transfer tape with one hand, you can constantly be pressing down all of those little pieces with that airbrush needle in your other hand. This is going to help really make sure that everything falls right into place for you. Now I want you to always make sure to go back and double check your work here, because as much as you may trust your aligning skills, it's still really easy for any of these incredibly small pieces to just slightly shift around a little bit. Then it's time to heat set this entire layer down thoroughly. Heat setting is definitely one of the most important steps to making sure that we don't end up with a lot of paint leaking underneath our vinyl, so you want to make sure that you're very diligent with this part of the process. First color down, nice and easy, but now it gets a little bit trickier to decide what color should we do next. The first thing that I'm looking for is, do we have any other colors similar to the one that we just did in terms of hue or value? On a separate pair of Houston Rockets themed Jordan 1s that I did recently, after I laid in the navy blue background, the next color that I did was this light grayish blue, because I knew that I could get there in just a couple of coats on top of my navy blue. And that's one of the things that we're at least trying to think about here. What's the next color that I could do in the least amount of coats? But now referring back to our Pistons logo, I don't necessarily have another color here that's very similar to my teal at all. So some of the other factors to consider when deciding upon your next color, and you could basically weigh these out equally, is do I have any bridge colors here? And what I mean by that is, do I have any colors that I absolutely will need to lay down before I can get to any of my other colors? And in the case of the Pistons logo, where I already have teal laid down, in order for me to get those yellows and those reds to pop on top of the teal, I'm definitely going to need to lay down white at some point. So if I lay down white next, that's going to make painting my yellow and my red much easier, therefore making this the perfect bridge color. And the other factor to at least consider is, are any of my remaining stencils just going to take up a much larger portion of the entire image? So in the case of the Houston Rockets pair that I did, after I laid down the 2 different shades of blue, I then moved into my red next, since that color takes up a large chunk of the entire logo. But now taking a look back at our Pistons logo, that white color is not only going to serve as a great bridge to help us get to our yellows and our reds from our teal, but it also happens to take up a large chunk of the entire image also. So all of those things combined led me to decide that white will make for a great second layer to this stencil. Before we can lay in any of that white paint though, you always want to paint a single coat of whatever color you have under underneath the stencil as your first coat right on top of the stencil. So because we just laid down teal paint under here, I want to lay down another coat of teal directly on top. And this is because if any paint were to leak underneath this stencil, it's going to be the first color that we lay on top. So if I lay down teal on top of this, if any paint were to leak underneath, it's going to be teal, therefore it's going to match the color we have underneath, and that's going to lead us to doing less touch-ups down the road. You could also essentially do a clear coat with neutral paint, which is colorless, because if any of that paint were to leak underneath the stencil, since it's colorless, you're not going to have to do many touch-ups there either. Now another quick little hack that I have for you right here, rather than moving directly into white paint, I think it's a much better idea to use something like mist, because white paint is so translucent that it's going to take you far too many coats to get it anywhere near solid. But if you were to lay in a couple of coats of mist instead, and then do your white on top of the mist, you're going to get there in a lot fewer steps. And as always, don't forget to allow that proper dry time in between coats and before placing any new vinyl on top. Once that's good to go, we can then grab the positive portion of our white stencil and begin aligning that with each of the registration marks. Same thing as before, as we start to peel back our transfer tape, we want to make sure that all of these tiny pieces of vinyl are staying perfectly intact. Something that you might catch here is I've actually allowed some of the letters from Detroit near the bottom of the logo stay on the transfer tape rather than ending up on the shoe. Now the reason for that is because this little area of the logo that I'm highlighting here in purple is now completely done. I've already laid in my teal, I've laid in my white, therefore I don't need any other color to enter into this area. So basically I could cover up this entire highlighted area because there's no further action needed here. Now it would be incredibly ideal if I had an additional stencil that was the exact size of this highlighted shape that I could cover this up with, but because I don't, I'm just going to cover this up with some thin tape. Now you're probably asking yourself, why on earth am I required to do any additional masking anywhere? What is the point of having all of these separate stencils on all of these separate layers if I still have to do more separate masking? And I hear you. But if we take an extremely zoomed in look near this region where we have some of these letters, if you see some of those darker edges along the letter T, that tells me those are areas where paint could potentially leak underneath. So some of the reasons that this could be happening would be due to misalignment. There's not a lot of room for error when it comes to trying to perfectly align each of these stencils on top of one another. Or something else that we might not be accounting for would be the actual width of the blade itself. And even though the blades are incredibly thin, there's still razor thin margins that we're talking about here that paint could seep into. So that's why it would be perfect if we had that additional stencil that I mentioned that we could place right here on top of this entire arc. But without going back and creating yet another piece to this stencil, some 1/8 inch masking tape will have to do the trick for us. Alright, almost time to get back to our painting. Since we just laid down our bridge color of white, that means we're ready to move into our yellow next. To begin that process, I'm going to lay down a quick coat of white on top of our vinyl just to seal the stencil, and then we can start painting in our yellow on top. That should begin to look nice and solid after about 2 coats. Now, something that I'm going to do with our yellow layered stencil, since this has far and away the most thin and smallest pieces, is I'm going to rip this one in half. And this is going to give me more flexibility to make sure that I'm able to better align all of these individual pieces. And this basically goes back to the whole working on a curved surface thing, which presents a lot of different challenges. You wouldn't need to do this step on a flat canvas, but by ripping this in half, now I'm going to give myself more flexibility to better align each of these individual halves, and more of these very thin yellow pieces are going to be exactly where they need to go. I'm going to start with our right half and align that with the registration mark, and then I'm going to go in and individually inspect every single piece and use my airbrush needle to align things as needed. Then I decided to rip the left half of the stencil in half again, so that I had just the yellow portion of the flame and the eye all by itself. And this is because all of the pieces involved in the yellow stencil are so incredibly thin and small anyway, it's basically like you're placing them all by hand. Then we just have a few more pieces of our yellow to lay down near each of our pistons letters. Here's another one of those situations where it would have been ideal for me to have an additional stencil made that could cover up the entirety of the letters that form the word pistons. Because now we've already completed everything that needs to happen within those letters. We've already laid in our yellow, our white, and our teal. So if I had another stencil that was the exact shape of this highlighted purple here, we'd really be in business. But because I don't, we need to try to cover these areas up by hand with some really thin tape just to play it safe. And if we zoom in really far here, you'll see that there is absolutely some areas that we just painted yellow and covered up with this white vinyl that paint could leak underneath. And what makes this tricky to do is all of these pistons letters are already incredibly small, so it's not easy to rip up thin pieces of tape and to try to fit them perfectly inside of there. But all you can do is try to get things covered up as best as possible here. Unless you're willing to go back and cut another stencil to fit this shape perfectly, you really just need to take the time to try to look for areas that you could potentially see paint leaking through and try to get those covered up. But spoiler alert, do you see any areas here that you think I needed to mask off more? I'll give you a quick little glimpse into the future and show you what happens when you let something as small as this slip past you. I'm going to opt for our red color next because that's going to cover up super easy on top of all of the yellow that we just laid down. A quick coat of yellow first, and then we're ready to do our red once that's all dry. 2 light coats of red should get the job done for us here. Next, we can grab the positive portion of our red stencil and begin aligning that with our registration marks just as we've done before. That'll be followed up with a quick round of heat setting and then a nice light coat of our red on top of here, and we're finally ready to move into our final 2 colors now. Since the 2 colors that we have left, black and light gray, both have incredibly opaque paints that are very easy to work with, it's really not going to make too big of a difference which one we choose to do on top of our red here. So in this situation, I'm just going to opt to go with my gray paint first, and at this point, you know the deal. We're going to do a couple light coats with some ample dry time in between, and then we're ready to grab the positive portion of our gray stencil, align that with our registration marks, and make sure that we heat set that down thoroughly. There's a couple small areas throughout that I'm going to try masking off since we know we won't be needing any of our remaining black paint to get anywhere near these sections of the logo. As always, we first hit it with a coat of light gray, allow some dry time, and then we're ready to finish this whole thing off with 2 light coats of our black paint. But now finally for the fun part, let's go ahead and start peeling back this vinyl piece by piece, revealing layer by layer, and see all of the hard work that we have underneath here. Always heat set your vinyl as you start to remove it because this is going to loosen up some of the adhesive, and if you're heating it as you're pulling it back, you'll also notice that you're going to start to weaken some of the elasticity of the vinyl, therefore making it so much easier for you to pull off. Now all you have left to do is get in there with your toothpick, your detail brush, your airbrush needle, whatever you prefer to use, and just look for tiny spots that you can touch up throughout. It doesn't matter who you are or how many times you've done this, no matter what, when you're working with a stencil this complex and this detailed, you're always going to have spots that you can touch up here and there. And once again, because we're working on a curved surface here with an image that's being stretched across multiple different panels, it's nearly impossible for everything to have lined up perfectly for you. As I hinted at earlier, these areas where we laid down our yellow stencil gave me the most trouble, and I had a little bit of the black paint leaking into those, so that was the area that I was talking about where I should have spent a little bit more time masking things off properly. But it's still a super easy fix nonetheless. So this is a super important time to really inspect your image and get in there and fine tune all of the details. You want to make sure that everything turns out as crisp as possible. I typically plan to incorporate a hard outline done by hand around the entire image, and this is going to give it a really nice, clean, solid look that'll tie the whole thing together. These are all of the little details that are going to add up to create the best, most accurate logo possible that people won't even be able to tell is painted at the end of the day. And here's a final look at how these Detroit Pistons Jordan 3s turned out. Alrighty, so if you made it to this point in the video, first off, thank you so much for watching for this long. Hopefully you were able to take away a little something from today's video and you feel confident enough to tackle your own multi-layer stencils. But if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, make sure you hit that subscribe button. But otherwise guys, I'm Dejesus, and now everybody get out there and just create.